Today's episode is an invitation into something deeper. Not a technique, not a theory, but a lived memory woven through blood, breath, and bone. We're going to explore the core wound, the thing that's always been there. It doesn't shift with affirmations and subconscious reprogrammings like limiting beliefs do. The core wound shapes your relationships, your sense of belonging, your sense of self, your sense of worthiness, maybe even your right to exist. You may have traced your core wound back to childhood, and indeed that's where it started in your lifetime. But today, I want to invite you to consider, what if it began long before you were born? What if your body has been carrying a story that your ancestors couldn't speak? I'm going to share a story that changed everything for me. It's about healing a core wound that didn't begin in this lifetime. I discovered its root in the ancestral field, eventually recognizing that it could only be healed in the ancestral field as well. My hope is that in witnessing my story, you might begin to feel into your own, into the core wound that shaped you, into the unspoken agreements that you inherited, and most importantly, what happens when we bring reverence and presence to the pain that's been echoing through generations. If you've ever felt like something in you can't be healed with mindset work alone, or simply by consciously changing your habits and behaviors, this episode is for you. So take a breath, because this episode might stir something ancient in you. And if it does, you're not alone. There are many more of us beginning to connect with this inner wisdom of the ages. Welcome to Inner Integration. I'm Meredith Miller, and this is Healing the Core Wound through the ancestral field. Have you ever felt like a pattern in your life, maybe fear, rage, or not feeling worthy of love, doesn't quite belong to you, but still lives inside you? Like you're carrying something ancient you didn't ask for. We see it in our relationships, in the way we work, in our relationship with money, in the fears we have, in our identity. That's your core wound. It's like an encrypted code that we spend a lifetime experiencing the resonance and aftermath of, often without words to explain what it is. The core wound is kind of like a program and a feeling, but really, it's a frequency. I mentioned in season 2, episode 1, that during the lockdowns, I started to notice that strange sensation of feeling like I was floating in the abyss, untethered to anything or anyone else. I eventually could describe it as a fear so big I had to name it terror. That program was, I don't have the right to exist. I couldn't even name it for a few years after I started noticing the sensation. Yet that feeling was there in the background my whole life. It was a womb imprint. And at first, I wanted to make that about my mother, but it wasn't just her. She was part of the same field I was. The family field, or ancestral field, is where the energetic imprint comes from. It's initially downloaded at the instant of conception. In the way I see it, it's like a zip folder containing a quantum energy packet with all the information from both sides of the lineage, the father and the mother. And this happens before we even have words. It's a non-verbal field of experience. This is why it's so hard to put words to it. The womb is where the trauma loop gets transferred from one generation to the next. Our core wound is imprinted. And we'll talk more about the womb imprints and the journey that got me from there to here in another episode. But today's exploration is on the dissolution of the core wound. I recently discovered that the core wound is actually an unconscious collective agreement, one that was made unknowingly at a soul level before we even came here. It's why we incarnated into a particular family, in a particular culture, in a particular time on earth. Yet we didn't just come to learn through the pain, though there is learning in the pain. We came to transmute the pain into gifts that ignite our purpose and service to humanity and this planet. The wound isn't a punishment, and it's not about karma. The wound is there as a signal because wisdom is encoded in the wound. The core wound is not the barrier to your purpose, it is the doorway. The pain was encoded not to punish you, but to teach. Not to trap, but to activate a deeper capacity. And we can only heal it in the collective container with the remembrance of an ancestor who was also trapped in the trauma loop. This is why when the ancestral wound is witnessed in its roots and the ancestor's story is reclaimed in coherence, a code hidden in the wound begins to light up. The wound becomes a compass, pointing not to where you're broken, but to what you're here to restore in the collective field of your family and our species. In this process, the core wound dissolves into your medicine. This is why the core wound cannot be fully healed through personal will alone, because it was never just yours. It's a relational field fracture in the family. And when we bring presence and love to the ancestor who couldn't complete their arc, we complete it for both. That's harmonic alchemy. Discovering the core wound is less about searching for answers and more about remembering what your body already knows. It was downloaded in the primordial space of the womb, where we received energetic and emotional imprints before we had words. So it's more about presencing the feelings and letting these meet you where thought cannot reach. The really interesting thing is that the core wound can only dissolve through co-witnessing because it lives in the ancestral field. This is why many modalities can touch the symptoms, but not the source. So the healing of the core wound isn't a solitary pursuit. It's a co-emergent act of sacred witnessing across time. The core wound is ancestral. We experience the resonance of our ancestors' unresolved trauma and emotions through our life experiences. This is why there are ancestral loops that we're caught in. So even though it feels really personal, this wound isn't really ours. It lives in us cellularly, yet it's an inheritance of those who came before. It's encrypted beneath layers of silence, protection, and collective forgetting. Together with our ancestors, whose presence in history is woven into our bodies and available in the morphogenic field around the DNA, we can allow the exiled grief to become embodied, honored, and repatterned. So the work of healing the core wound isn't just for us, but also for our ancestors in the entire morphogenic field of the family that shaped us. This kind of transmutation of the core wound dissolves the distortions and emotional charge because it no longer needs to be held in the silence. The core wound is different from other limiting beliefs. It sounds like a belief when we put it into words, I don't have the right to exist, yet it was installed before we even had words. So it isn't just a belief. It's a frequency woven into the ancestral field. That's why we can't heal it by rethinking or replacing the belief. We heal it by remembering what the body already knows and feeling what our lineage could not. Then we can make new agreements. So as we begin this journey, I'd like to invite you to breathe into the part of you that doesn't need to understand with your rational mind, only to feel and know truth by its tone. I'm sharing a story from my own ancestral healing, not as a map, but as a mirror. And what I'm about to share includes specific threads from my lineage. My hope is that through these particulars, you'll feel the resonance of something universal, the inherited burdens that live silently within many of us, even though yours are unique, as are mine. This is not a prescription or a path you must follow, but a reflection of what becomes possible when we bring embodiment, truth, presence, and love to the unseen threads that shape our becoming. We are tracing how a pattern echoes across generations, offering empathic witnessing for the ancestor who birthed it, as well as to all the family members who inherited, suppressed, or amplified it, including ourselves. This story is called Amazing Grace. One morning before yoga, the ladies and I were talking about origins, where we're from. I mentioned I'm originally from Youngstown, Ohio, the murder capital of the world per capita in the late 1990s, and how I couldn't wait to get out of there. As we talked, I could remember the frequency of a place I haven't visited in years. After class, I went to the infrared sauna. As I walked in, one of the spa employees held the door open for me with a smile. Sometimes in the sauna, I meditate. Other times I process or tune into the creator. And to be really honest, sometimes I'm just thinking about my grocery list or the work I need to get done that day. But that morning, I intended to connect with the trauma surfacing from my left hip. Being the left side, I knew it related to my mother's lineage. As soon as I connected with my body as an anchor of that pattern, I saw the thread went back to my grandmother's sister. Her name was Grace. Just weeks before, also at that spa, I randomly realized that if I hadn't inherited my father's stubbornness, which helped me leave Youngstown at 19, I might not have survived. I would have inevitably followed Grace's path. And on that day I had that realization a couple weeks before, I met one of the spa employees for the first time. Her name is also Grace. And while I was waiting for one of the services, she came over to ask what I do for a living. I mentioned generational trauma healing and she lit up, knowing exactly what I was referring to. And that doesn't always happen. But I didn't see the synchronicity at the time. I'd only seen her twice. Once on the day I had the insight about my dad's stubbornness being a saving grace, and the second time, the day with the hip pain, when she held open the door for me as I was arriving. The field of synchronicities is electrified when we're on the track of ancestral patterns. My grandma's older sister, Grace, was the oldest and the only sibling born in Italy. She was very young when my great-grandparents emigrated, and then the rest of the children were born in Youngstown. The story was that Grace wanted to return to Italy, but her parents said no. And she ended up taking her life at just 16 years old. I always wondered why, and I assumed she must have felt different as the only one not born in America. But as a little kid, she would have assimilated easily, so something didn't add up. And the rest of the story was never spoken. So that day in the sauna, tuning into her story through my hip, I realized she was 16 and pregnant. Suddenly, head to toe chills and the whole story clicked into place. My great-grandfather, a kind and generous man who unfortunately lacked healthy boundaries, would visit the local boys sleeping in the ravine behind their property. He'd wander down there to play his banjo and often invited them to the home for meals. It was likely one of those boys. But I didn't feel Grace loved the boy. The story wasn't about him. It was the fear. She was terrified. She knew her mother would react violently, so she tried to escape to Italy, but was denied. And with no options left, as a young woman 100 years ago, death became her only escape. After her death, her mother made sure no one spoke of her. She even destroyed photos. The rest of the kids were expected to pretend it didn't happen, but it did. That didn't just affect Grace. The secret that was buried with her became a heavy, invisible mass of energy distorting the entire family field. Surely, even generations later, everyone felt it in their own way without knowing it. When I saw Grace in my mind's eye that morning in the sauna, she was angry, deeply sad, yet also invisible. I realized it was because she felt like they erased her. I don't have the right to exist. She was carrying a heavy burden of shame, regret, anger, confusion, abandonment, existential loneliness. She'd been alone in the darkness, in this space of the exiled and forgotten for so long. As I unpacked the story, so much began to make sense. I realized I was carrying Grace's patterns. It wasn't just my pain, it was ancestral. The suicidal impulse I felt in my early 20s, the core wound, I don't have the right to exist, the powerless rage lodged in my left hip, flaring up during life transitions, reminding me I was afraid to move forward. It was Grace who didn't have a way to move forward. The womb imprint that haunted me my whole life. The fear so big I named it terror. It wasn't just my fear. It was also Grace's fear, and the fear of her unborn baby too. I never let myself get pregnant, and I never wanted to have a baby. I was terrified of it. And now I know it was because that energy was frozen in my womb too. My unexplainable desperation to escape Youngstown since I was very young, everything connected back to Grace's story. My grandmother rarely mentioned her sister Grace until the later years of her life. And when she did, she'd shut down in tears. I didn't know what to do. I wish I had known then how to ask, how to listen, how to hold space for her to feel. I didn't even know the word trauma at the time. Through that experience, my grandma was taught to look away from pain, pretending it didn't happen. That's how she survived. So as an adult, she would hyper-focus on things that didn't matter, making a big deal of them because that was the only place it felt safe to channel the fear, the rage, the grief. She was more at peace when I knew her, but the stories of her as a younger mother, often hysterical, well, all of that made sense too. She was terrified and stuffing down the pain because she didn't know any other way to live. She suppressed trauma, which fit perfectly with an abusive husband. She knew what he was doing, but didn't act. About 10 years ago, in an ayahuasca ceremony, she came to me and admitted knowing that my grandfather had sexually abused me. And I forgave her because my love for her was so much bigger than the pain of those experiences, which I had already been transmuting into purpose. But that day in the sauna, I finally understood why she hadn't done anything. My mother inherited this burden too, in her own way, and I blamed her for a long time for the ways that her unprocessed pain affected me. And then in my effort to heal, I exiled myself from her and the family, which was necessary at the time. Yet I unknowingly perpetuated the same ancestral trauma loop, making her feel like she didn't have the right to exist either, a wound she also carries. Instantly, I had a new level of compassion for her and for myself. So that day in the sauna, it was time to help Grace liberate herself and liberate myself from the burden too. Grace wanted to know that she was remembered, that she mattered, that she's loved, and most importantly, that she's free. I acknowledged her core wound, which is the same as mine. I don't have the right to exist. I asked her if she wanted to know that she's worthy, remembered, loved, and free. We released the terror that she experienced, as well as the pain and fracture that the family experienced as a result of how her death was handled. We released the suicide death drive programming from the ancestral field. I invited her to be released from the darkness so she could leave behind the trauma, regret, guilt, and shame. And while at first she was just a shadow, during this process she became more visible in my mind's eye. I welcomed Grace back into the family and offered all of these light codes for anyone in my lineage who wants to receive it. I released myself from the obligation of carrying these burdens any longer. The shame, fear, frustration, the pain of the mother's emotional absence, and the harshness as self-protection from the pain. The feeling of being unloved, the anger, the powerless rage, the feeling that there's no options, no escape, the feeling of being unworthy of existing, and the heaviest burden of them all, which was the silent secret encapsulating the shame. As the emotional residue and obligations released, things got a lot lighter. Then, I imagined showing Grace another path forward. I offered her a boat ticket to Italy. In my mind, she left Youngstown on the train with a closeted gay neighbor and headed to New York. They pretended to be brother and sister, but they never got on the boat. He found freedom in the gay community there. She met a sweet New York Italian man in Brooklyn. They got married, and he raised Grace's daughter as his own. Grace became an artist in the roaring 20s. Eventually, her daughter sang and danced on Broadway. And Grace finally returned to Italy much after World War II. She was full of life, happy, smiling, creative, fulfilled. This vision brought immense catharsis in my body. I was sobbing the relief I felt for her and me. The hip pain vanished almost immediately. That session lasted 20 minutes, but it felt like years. Uranus was exactly transiting my natal moon at the time, and it brought a powerful ancestral liberation. Grace asked me to sing Amazing Grace in her honor, and I did. The next day, I drove past a church named Grace. One of my friends posted something unrelated about that song a few days later. It seemed like every video I clicked on mentioned Grace. Bumper stickers, one after the other, synchronicities bloomed with new life force energy in the field. The emotional charge was gone, and so was the distortion with which I saw myself and the world. I finally saw the opening of the possibility that I could finally return to my podcast. And even now, amid continued shadow banning, covert censorship, weird tech glitches, screenshots that people are sending me that they can't listen to my content, and whatever shenanigans are going on behind the scenes, it's okay. In the past, that used to collapse me because it triggered my core wound, not having the right to exist. Now, it's kind of funny because it's so ridiculous, and I feel a deep sense of peace about it because I trust that no matter what interference there is, people who are aligned with the message will find it when they're ready to hear it in divine timing. I haven't been to Italy in 20 years, but I decided that one day I'll go back and plant an olive tree in Grace's honor in the province her father was from. She was named after his ancestors, Graziella. What were the gifts transmuted from that burden that I was carrying my whole life? Liberated creativity, emotional freedom, clarity, sovereignty, a whole other level of inner peace, a reactivation of my purpose, and an unshakable faith in the vision of the mission I'm here to embody. A growing sense that my soulmate is inevitably drawing closer. Constant signs and confirmation of that. It taught me deeper compassion for myself and my family. Of all my ancestral healing work, and I've done quite a lot over the recent years, this one was the most impactful because it unrooted the core wound and created the shared container with my ancestor where we could finally alchemize it. I'd been recoding layers of my core wound for over a decade. I did a lot of inner child integration work with myself at various ages and key moments of childhood, kind of like I shared in the last episode on loneliness with the woman, the healer, whose 4-year-old inner child was stuck from the moment the day that her dad disappeared. I did lots of theta healing sessions on belief programs. I studied various modalities around core wounds, and it was all helpful, but still incomplete. At some point, I realized the core wound had something to do with the womb imprint, and something more was needed to transmute it. And I had done a process called healing the baby in the womb multiple times based on a theta healing technique. But that technique itself wasn't really getting to the core of what was frozen in time in the ancestral field and stored in my body. It was lacking the somatic element and a way of transmuting the wound. So eventually, after a back crisis brought my attention to the way my body was curling into fetal position, I did my somatic inner child reclamation technique with myself as the baby in the womb and as a newborn. Then a series of events over the next months led me to the sauna experience. And what unfolded afterward was this massive realization of the core wound as an unconscious collective agreement based on ancestral inheritance. In the womb, we inherit trauma not as story, but as atmosphere. That's why it lingers without name. And analysis, prayer, or conscious decisions, while helpful to a point, can't bring the resolution. Instead, it requires somatic processing through feeling to connect with the ancestral field. So it's not about talking with dead people or spirits. This connection to all those who came before you is in your body and the morphogenic field around the DNA. You can use your DNA like a movie projector and ask the field to select the particular reel or tape of history that's needed to shift the pattern that you're tracking. Unprocessed ancestral trauma isn't stored as conscious memory because it was before our time. And it's not usually talked about because it isn't always about what was said and done. In fact, it's primarily about what was suppressed, what wasn't spoken about, felt, grieved, or embodied. Of course, the absence of being able to feel it finds expression in people's behaviors. So what was said and done is actually revealing clues to the secrets held in silence. Ancestral trauma is stored as frozen emotion encapsulated in the silence, suppression, and secrecy that gets passed down. It's an energy that never got to move. Emotion is energy in motion. It's meant to move, but with trauma, that movement is interrupted and incomplete. That becomes like a waveform that's stuck in the family field. And when the awareness returns, we often try to name it, and that's a good first step. But what it really wants is to be felt. That happens in the body. When we can feel it, the old waveform can collapse and a new flow emerges. What are the secrets, the silent rules, or emotional patterns that run through your family? What did you learn was unsafe to feel or express? And how did that end up showing up in your life? What I'm calling ancestral field alchemy and transmuting the core wound is about reconciliation. It's a form of multi-generational integration. And when done with reverence and sovereignty, it changes everything. This is the most powerful way I've found to transmute the core wound into wisdom, peace, neutrality, and purpose. When we see the wound as something personal, what people did to us, we miss the bigger picture. It feels personal and people are responsible for their actions, but it's actually patterned, inherited, and encrypted beneath layers of generational silence, protection, and collective forgetting. You don't heal it by rethinking it or replacing one belief with another. You heal it by remembering what your body already knows and by feeling what your lineage could not. When we compassionately witness its origin, expanding beyond the personal to the ancestral, the resistance dissolves. That moment brings peace to you and your ancestor who held it before you. and it offers those upgraded codes to anyone else in your lineage who's ready to receive. I found that other limiting beliefs, whether formed through experience or inheritance, often shifted immediately through subconscious reprogramming, like the theta healing technique. But the core wound held on until I discovered this. Ancestral field alchemy created the space for the core wound's distortions, emotional residue, and energetic imprint to finally begin dissolving. Because the root was frozen in the ancestral field and living in the body. And here's what I now understand. The core wound isn't meant to be healed alone, because in many ways, it was never yours alone. It was a collective, unspoken agreement passed down through generations, and it exists with a purpose. To rewrite that agreement requires more than inner work, though it does start within. It requires relational witnessing, a sacred recognition of the ancestor's story, felt and seen through our body, where the resonance still lives in the imprint. The core wound dissolves, not by erasing the wound, but by transforming the agreement. Then the collective forgetting becomes collective remembrance. The exiled grief becomes embodied, honored, and recoded wisdom. And so the lineage breathes differently. In my case, not just for me, but also for Grace, shifting the entire morphogenic field that shaped us both. Healing the core wound is a co-emergent act. Now, my process is not the way, but it's the only path I've found that reaches the depths of where the core wound lives, in the ancestral field. It's a demonstration of what becomes possible when we slow down, listen, feel, name, and alchemize what has long been held in the silence and shadows of the bloodline. The core wound is not a punishment. It's a frequency pattern, an echo in the ancestral field. It didn't begin with you, but it lives in you. The wound you're carrying is not karmic debt. It's ancestral inertia, a truth that was never voiced, a grief that was never held, a movement that was never completed, a distortion that was never alchemized. The transmission of karma follows an individual soul across lifetimes. The transmission of ancestral frequency patterns travels through the family morphogenic field, passed down epigenetically, emotionally, and psychically through generations. Your relationship to karma is your own echo returning, and it asks you to complete or transmute what you began. The ancestral wounds are not yours in origin, but they live in you because you are the living expression of your lineage. So in your relationship with the ancestral wounds, these ask you to witness and complete what they could not. The energetic tone of karma is often felt as a pull toward balance, like a circuit needing to close. The energetic tone of ancestral wounds feels like stuckness, inherited shame, grief, or identity distortion that doesn't seem to make sense, though we see the resonance in our life experiences and it reveals itself through somatic presence. The healing pathway for karma dissolves through direct responsibility and conscious closure, choosing differently, embodying wisdom, developing virtues, and harmonizing the energy loop. The healing pathway for ancestral wounds is distinct. These are transmuted through relational reconciliation, offering co-witnessing, empathy, and truth to an ancestor's story that was frozen in silence or suppression. So what you receive when karma resolves is you gain freedom from repetition. That cycle ends. What you receive when ancestral wounding is alchemized is you unlock the medicine within the wound, The pain becomes purpose. The fracture becomes your compass. Karmic resolution asks, what did I leave incomplete? Ancestral alchemy asks, what did they pass forward unhealed? And what can I now restore in the field we share? So this is not debt, it's invitation. To be the one who remembers, to be the one who feels what they couldn't, to become the harmonic answer to a generational longing. Karma is individual, and the ancestral loop is collective. Karma is based on personal action, whereas ancestral wounds are based on inheritance. Karma leads to balance and the discovery of virtues, whereas ancestral alchemy leads to the embodiment of medicine and purpose. Karma asks for right action, and the ancestral wound asks for presence, reverence, and reconciliation. Karma is the returning echo of your own choice, seeking balance, virtue, and closure. Ancestral wounding is the resonant imprint of the ancestors' unfinished story, seeking presence, coherence, and transmutation. Karma asks for integrity and action. Ancestral alchemy asks for reverence and presence. One completes your personal cycle. The other restores your relational field. One dissolves through right movement. The other heals through still witnessing. Both are sacred, but only one is yours. The other was entrusted to you because your body, your breath, your becoming had the capacity to remember what they could not. Restoring the ancestral field isn't about becoming healed, so to speak. It's about becoming a stable witness and point of coherence within a once fractured field. Essentially, when the ancestral field is harmonized, you stop living the story and begin transmitting the medicine. You stop carrying what wasn't yours, which gives way to clarity and healthy differentiation. The core wound no longer distorts your self-perception, so you begin to see yourself as who you really are. The generational silence transforms into embodied wisdom. You become a beacon of coherence in your family line and in the world. You experience generational reconciliation in the body, as well as a felt sense of peace, integration, or belonging with your bloodline, even if you're still physically estranged. The core wound is the doorway. What I've discovered again and again is that the core wound is not the thing in the way of your purpose. It is the way. It holds the exact code for the medicine you're here to carry. Yet, you don't have to hold on to the pain, the fragmentation, and the distortion to embody that wisdom in the world. When you meet the pain with reverence, sovereignty, and relational witnessing together with your ancestors, it softens, not just for you, but also for them and for those who are yet to be. And beneath it, something begins to stir as new gifts emerge. Wisdom, peace, neutrality, purpose. This wound is not healed alone because it was never formed alone. It exists in the shared field with your ancestors. And when you witness what they could not, and you reconcile that energy of exile, you offer a new agreement to the entire lineage. That's ancestral field alchemy. So the core wound is not just a painful belief, it's a living frequency woven through time. And when you remember that, when you stop trying to rebel against it or fix it alone, and instead enter the ancestral field with presence, you discover that the core wound is not the lock, it's the key. It doesn't point to where you're broken, it points to what you're here to restore. This is how suffering becomes sacred. This is how trauma becomes art. This is how the core wound becomes your compass, your true north, your purpose, and the embodiment of the unique divine mission that you're here to serve. I want to invite you into a new level of self-inquiry if you'd like to recognize and heal your core wounds. What wound has shaped your life the most? What does it sound like? And what does it feel like in your body? Did you notice how it got activated in 2020? You probably won't notice the wound directly and immediately. First, you'll notice your defensive adaptations to the wound. Those are your breadcrumbs. When you can identify those behaviors, you're on the trail. Now, not everyone will use ceremonial work as I do. You can explore ancestral healing through other paths. For example, writing a letter to an ancestor you never met. Maybe for some reason you feel a strong resonance with the stories that were told about someone in your family before your time. Or maybe you feel pulled to honor a family member whose story was never told. When you connect with your body, ask, whose pain might I be carrying? You might find elemental environments, fire, water, earth, air, helpful for this process. So I described how this experience with Grace took place in the sauna. You can try sauna, temazcal, sweat lodge, hot springs, earthing, traveling to ancestral lands, breath work, whatever is calling you. Notice any symbols, signs, songs, dreams, body symptoms, and synchronicities that seem to have a particular emotional charge for you. These can be invitations, not just coincidences or pathologies. Is there a pattern you see or feel? Remember, this work is less logical, intellectual, and analytical. It's much more intuitive and somatic. So if you're really smart, that might actually be one of your obstacles because you're used to using your intellect to figure things out. And this process is about feeling at the soul level. What helps you get out of your head and more into your body and presence? What I've shared today is the beginning of a much deeper remembering. This work, which I call ancestral field alchemy, begins with the dominant wound. It's the more visible wound, the one that shouts, the one we're rebelling against. It comes from the lineage of the more dominant parent. But there's another, a second wound that hides deeper beneath the silence, secrets, and inherited shame. It lives not in rebellion, but in shadow. It's the one we really want to suppress and pretend isn't there. It comes from the lineage of the more passive parent, and it too is waiting to be seen. These two wounds, one from each side of the lineage, work in tandem, compounding one another. Yet each wound has its own medicine and gifts. In a future episode, we'll open the door to the silent wound. We'll explore how the feminine and masculine lineages transmit their stories not through gender, but through energetic frequency. Because it may be that the mother was the dominant force in the family and the father was the more passive force. So this work is not just about healing the past. It's about restoring the truth that lives beyond time and embodying that truth in your daily life. Whether you have kids and grandkids or not, this becomes the new legacy that you share with others. This is the work starting with inner child reclamation to gain a sense of inner safety, stability of self, and then expanding into the ancestral field alchemy. This is what I do with my private clients nowadays. If you'd like to work privately with me, you'll find the link for one-on-ones in the show notes or on my website, innerintegration.com. I also have a 3-month program called Becoming You for those who want a guide to walk with you as you take a deep dive into embodying your purpose and leading with light. And if you'd like the opportunity to do some of this work with me at no cost, in exchange for your courage to share your process with the world, you can apply to be a podcast guest with the link in the show notes. That's where you can read more about it to see if it's something you're interested in doing. If this topic is speaking to you, I want to invite you to share your reflections or stories. And of course, you can feel free to leave public comments if you like. Though I realize this inner work is deeply vulnerable and personal, much more so than the narcissistic abuse themes we talked about years ago. That's why I've created some ways you can message me privately, and you'll find those links in the show notes. Over the recent weeks, I've received incredible messages from beautiful souls feeling the alignment with the inner work focus of season 2 and how these themes are showing up in their lives. I love reading those messages and hearing about the synchronicities, knowing that more people are feeling this soul calling during these liminal spaces in our rapidly changing world of the 2020s. This moment in history is ripe with collective readiness for ancestral repair, yet many don't know how to access it or recognize its call. We each carry a thread of the tapestry, and when we shift our thread by feeling, by witnessing, by reconciling, by choosing differently, we don't just heal ourselves, we change the resonance of the whole family field, past and future. And that contributes to a healing world. This is the harmonic restoration of lineages through generational alchemy. As you begin to embody the medicine from the wound, that's also one of the most beautiful gifts you can give yourself, your family, and the world. Next week, we're going to explore the continuation of our ancestral stories and other ways that the history of those who came before us is still living in our bodies and our lives. If this speaks to your soul, make sure to subscribe or follow wherever you listen to podcasts. Share this with someone else in the path, someone who's ready to go deeper, beyond the surface of healing and into true integration. And if you'd like to leave a message or note for me, something that resonated, something you want to hear about, you'll find that link in the show notes where you can do that. Remember, keep listening within. No more playing small. It's time to remember who you are. This world needs your wholeness now more than ever. You are not the wound. You are the medicine. Let your trauma become your map to purpose. Thank you for joining me today for this transmission of the Inner Integration podcast. Remember this, you are not broken. You are not behind. Your trauma wasn't a detour. It was initiation, an immersion into the very wisdom your soul came here to embody. To go deeper into this work, visit innerintegration.com. And until next time, big hug to you.